Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of January. Today's video will focus on the final stages of the Battle of Velyka Novosilka. We'll also, of course, look at the Andriivka and Pokrovsk fronts before moving on to advances in Chasiv Yar, the Luhansk front, and really importantly, the Kursk region. The Russians have now reached the western outskirts of Velyka, and I want to look at the upcoming clashes over there by the end of today's video. But of course, we're going to begin with Velyka Novosilka as we do most of the time. Before we get into it, please like and subscribe. And hopefully this weekend, I'll have enough time to talk about the implications of the new Trump presidency and some of the executive orders he signed and comments about Ukraine. Let's begin, though, by looking at the course of the battle here in Velyka Novosilka, wherein the Ukrainians do still retain control and have a strong presence in the center of the town in between the Mokriali and Kashlach rivers. So it is a pretty narrow corridor of territory, but one that the Russians have been unable to penetrate, and they probably are not even trying to do at the moment because their focus is on continuing to seal the lid onto what remains of the very, very small breathing space that the Ukrainians retain. Currently, the Ukrainians have this corridor amounting to 2.3 kilometers, which spans from basically the northern parts over here, like it's basically just south of Novi Komar, all the way to the area north of Vermivka. And the only way to go over it is by crossing the Mokriali River. So the Ukrainians understand that it is not sustainable because they do still have several platoons worth, at the very least, of troops operating in this region, and they're probably from the 110th Mechanized Brigade, along with two of the battalions of the Presidential Brigade, the 3rd Battalion and the 20th Battalion. And they are working as a vanguard force to retain control of the frontline perimeter that you see has been holding on for a very long time at the eastern approaches to the city, but recently has started to experience some cracks. Same thing with the southern approaches, been able to really maintain control over there despite a lot of pressure, whereas it has not seen the same success in areas like Neskuchnia and Vermivka recently. But now the Ukrainians are trying to turn the tide by conducting counterattacks to retake at least certain portions of Vermivka. That's extremely necessary because right now the only way for the Ukrainians to escape is through this narrow corridor that is only on open fields. There's no paved road. There's not even an unpaved road or gravel road, anything of the sort to go through. So vehicles are out of the question, and they have been for a while. Going in groups of probably more than two is also out of the question at this point in time because of how dangerous it would be. Just leaving a basement in the center of the town and going northwards into an exposed area, it's extremely, extremely dangerous and leaves those soldiers susceptible to immediate FPV strikes or artillery shelling because the Russian FPV crews over here are extremely strong. We're going to talk about why in a moment. And so the Ukrainians, their best option that they've assessed to be the case is that they need to retake portions of Vermivka in order to unlock, first of all, a wider corridor to advance through or to withdraw through. And that would include open fields that would now be under their control to a larger extent, but also perhaps reaching all the way southwards to this road over here. That would be their dream scenario, to get control over this road for a temporary period of time, just to allow movement running along here just enough to save a large portion of their garrison, which is a pretty strong force because we're looking at probably the highest quality elements from the entire Velyka Novosilka garrison, which I think I estimated was at like 15,000, maybe a bit more than that. But I remember having some sort of similar estimates to that effect. And I made a point of noting that the caliber of forces is relatively low, with the exception of the newly moved in vanguard forces like the 110th Brigade and the battalions of the Presidential Brigade. And those are the ones that are currently battling it out, trying to hold on to remains of the town and also trying to find a way out. So recently, the Ukrainians have started to organize these larger armored forces, trying to move them southwards from Kamar to begin to put pressure and alleviate the pressure from where the Russians are located, situated north of Velyka Novosilka, including Novi Komar. So there was a Russian really opportunity where they spotted Ukrainian armored groupings organizing in this village over here, Doprienohiria, and Russian fiber optic FPV drones have been very active around here. Starting January 10th, the Russians began to mass introduce those fiber optic drones to this part of the front line, as was reported by the 31st Mechanized Brigade. They have a range of between 15 to 20 kilometers and are completely immune to the electronic warfare systems the Ukrainians have in these areas. The downside is they have a bit of a lower explosive yield due to the range, and there are issues sometimes where the fiber optics could get caught and could sort of turn away its course and prevent it from reaching its final destination. But those are issues that currently aren't stopping the Russians from inflicting some significant damage onto Ukrainian targets, not just on the rear, but also especially on the front line. So you have Ukrainian various pieces of equipment, including Cossacks, BMP 1s, BVP 1s, and Max Pros, MRAPs, T-64s, all of these weapons and vehicles that are being moved in to try to conduct a localized counterattack, or at the very least move in to help rescue some of the Ukrainian forces near the front lines. They're being stuck before they even reach that point by Russian drone crews, including the Vostok group. It's one that's been really active around here for over a year and a half, and so they have a lot of experience with operating drones. And here you can see the 37th Brigade, they conducted those sort of strikes onto the BMP that I was talking about beforehand. And this is located just a couple of meters away from Novi Komar and a couple of 100 meters from Velyka Novosilka itself. So despite the attempts of the Ukrainians to counterattack both the north of Novi Komar and to widen the corridor to really help feed a lifeline to Velyka Novosilka, so far we haven't seen any proof of it being successful. We just know that the clashes over here are really, really intense, and that's why the Russians have been unable to fully close the lid yet, and they're still in the process of holding on and absorbing the final Ukrainian attempt at having some sort of reprieve in this region. But at the same time, they're able to chip away at areas that the Ukrainians can no longer feasibly hold on to, including the eastern approaches to the town, where you can see they captured 0.8 square kilometers of territory. They crossed over the Kashlats River. Any Ukrainian holdings that are east of this river, for instance, or say west of the Mokriali River, they are now either in a gray zone or under solid Russian control. And the Russians are going to try to take advantage as well of this southern part of Velyka Novosilka, south of the Mokriali River to be specific, and also the Shaitanka River, and try to isolate it piecemeal and then chip away at that as well. But really, the core still remains an issue, and the Ukrainians, they need an immediate solution to try to just get out as many men as possible with the least amount of casualties. And the window of opportunity closes as time goes on, because the Russians begin to solidify control in areas they took over, like Vermivka. But let's move a bit to the north. You could see over here the Russians captured a small piece of territory, but again, the Russian efforts in the area south of Rozliv and also to the south of Andriivka more generally have been more subdued recently, because there's been a shift in focus, and because there is just an intense amount of Ukrainian FPV coverage in this area. There aren't a lot of armored commitments. The Russians aren't really deploying a lot of armored vehicles to this region. So a lot of the assaults are just being conducted on foot. And that makes it extremely dangerous, because Ukrainian drone crews are prepared for that opportunity. And, walking, say, 5 kilometers out in the open like that to the next settlement is basically impossible. So any sort of gains are minimal at this stage in time. And you can see that based on the video from January 21st from the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, where they conducted drones dropping grenades onto individual Russian soldiers in tree lines. You could also see here the Ukrainians conducted a localized counterattack and retook parts of Zelenivka, running along the Sukhyali River. This was necessary, and the Ukrainians took back 2 square kilometers in the process. It was done in order to alleviate pressure that was really hitting close to home for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians right now, they're trying to build up a solid defense line along the eastern approaches and southern approaches of Andriivka. But that is simply not possible, given the fact that the Russian forces, up until a couple of days ago, were just, say, 1 kilometer away from Mulakli, one of the final villages before you actually reach the Vavcha River and then Andriivka. And additionally, the Russians were only about, like 2 kilometers away from Kostiano Tonopil. So that's just way too close for the final suburbs that are sort of like the outer ring of defense for the key city. that is holding down the entire southern Donetsk area at the moment, because the fall of Andriivka would then precipitate the fall of all the trenches to the north and give Russians access to the highway that runs all the way to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro and to the Mokryali River line to areas east of Komar over here. So that is something to keep in mind, and it's why the Ukrainians are pouring in a lot of resources to hold on to this town for as long as possible. And that's why the Ukrainians launched this attack using the 37th Marine Brigade, one of their best units in this region. And it's an area where they sort of sensed that there was a lack of Russian emphasis for a couple of weeks. And that's why they took the initiative and were able to push it back slightly, just in order to give the Ukrainians more generally breathing space, not only in the urban cluster, but also a bit to the east with the Dakhne pocket, where the clashes are also really fierce at the moment. But despite that fact, the Russian forces were able to advance 1.1 kilometers northwards. And we could look actually at the extent of the advance. It's 1.5 kilometers north along a 1.5 square kilometer area. This was filmed by the 479th and Perun drone groups. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry and onto their mortars that are pretty close to the front line, along with their shelters. So in this area, actually, the Russians were able to continue advancing despite advance by the Ukrainian side a bit to the east. The Russians were able to partially repel due to taking out several armored vehicles during the assault, but now Zelenivka is split. But now the Russians have the sort of forward outpost that is pretty close to Konstantinopil. Looking to the east, though, in Dakhne, the clashes are fierce, and there isn't an update yet about who was able to come out supreme. And probably the answer is ambiguous, because a lot of the satellite imagery from the past couple of days is that there's a lot of fires. There's a lot of them that are just raging in the southern parts of the town. The Russians probably launched an armored assault coming from the industrial zone westwards and were able to dismount forces, and at the same time had a large-scale artillery barrage to support those forces and really make it difficult for the 46th Air Assault Brigade to remain over here. Now, the results of the Russian bombardment and assaults, those remain to be seen, because we have not seen geolocations from here. We have also not seen any updates from the Ukrainian side, like Petrenko and Deep States, just yet. So we're going to have to wait and see. But the Ukrainians are doubling down on their positions over here. We see vehicle tracks running south of Dakhne because the Ukrainians are sending in armored vehicles to reinforce the trenches located just south of it, because they're trying to hold on to a solid defense line running vertically from the north to the south. That's a key priority of theirs. They really do want to maintain control over this pocket region as an insurance measure for the Andriivka region. As I said before, it's a 30 square kilometer piece of territory that they're trying to retain control over. At the same time, though, the Russian forces are really capitalizing over the fact that the Ukrainians just lack trenches, they lack enough manpower, and they lack any organized settlements to use as a node of defense in the area north of Andriivka and west of Slovyanka and Petropavlivka. You can see over here they captured 5.5 square kilometers of territory in quick succession. Let's actually measure the extent of the advance. It's 2.5 kilometers westwards. Now the Russians are advancing along two lower lying valleys. These are just perfect routes that then intersect along this region of the highway that goes from the north to the south. And the Russians are actually pretty close to reaching the local anti-tank ditch and the highway itself, which would give them access to a road to attack the northern flank of Andriivka. And there's, as I said before, no settlement nearby that the Ukrainians could use to organize and conduct a counterattack through, or to just drag out the fighting. They have these holdings to the north that are also exposed. They're just open fields with some tree lines, and you have small-scale Ukrainian resistance over there. But the focus hasn't really been on that. It's more so been on the area a bit to the south, where the 35th Marine Brigade is currently stationed, trying to repel the Russian attacks, but not necessarily doing so in close quarters combats, more so utilizing their aerial possibilities. So a lot of drone crews of the Ukrainians are operating around here, both from the 35th Brigade, but also from the Birds of Magyar Regiment. They've been really active around here recently, just trying to pick off individual Russian soldiers that are walking through open fields, because, again, armored assaults aren't the most common in this particular area at this point in time. That could change if the Russians see an opportunity here and decide that it's worth risking the material damage to, have some sort of larger scale breakthrough. But in terms of just striking individual Russian soldiers, the Birds of Magyar unit is doing that pretty commonly right now. Along with the 15th National Guard Brigade, they also conduct some strikes on the Russian newly acquired trenches and dugouts over the past 24 hours. And by the way, the 414th Unmanned Strike Aviation Brigade, they are actually the new iteration of the Birds of Magyar regiment because it's been promoted to a brigade-sized formation, and it's all under the umbrella of the Marine Corps. So they're operating around here. And recently, they actually utilized a fiber optic FPV that had a range of 41 kilometers. That is crazy. I think that's a new record. Usually we talk about like maximum 20 kilometers, but like imagine 41 kilometers from the front line. You're looking at an area that would reach all the way to the outskirts of Donetsk city in areas like Pisky. So that is really, really deep. And they used ATGM explosives in their FPV. It's a hexacopter. That's what it's called. It's not called a quadcopter. It's a hexacopter. And it also used this 3D printed casing in order to hold the explosive charge. So now those 3D printed casings are being mass produced and given to various other hexacopters. I don't know how many others have that sort of range, but that's just a first. And I thought that it's a pretty cool development in the technology for this war. Looking to the north, though, I want to focus on the Chasiv Yar region. That area is of particular importance right now. So the Russian forces, especially Ahmad elements, they were able to capture 1.4 square kilometers of territory in the forested region south of, I think it's the Novi district. And you could see over here the geolocation proving their presence because there were sappers from the Ahmad's elements that were able to throw explosives into Ukrainian positions in houses in what was formerly a summer camp. And so that's a pretty good indicator that now they're operating here, trying to expel the Ukrainians from the actual structures in this region. They've already been able to clear out much of the forested region, and they're pretty close to reaching some of the paved roads over here, the local quarries, and finally would be able to connect with the actual Russian foothold in the center of Chasiv Yar that was able to just pave itself a couple of kilometers deep on January 18th. So that's a part of the Russian objective right now, uniting the forces from the Ahmad elements that have been operating across the Nabas Canal for a while now with the 98th VDV regiment that is currently engaged in fierce clashes in the center of Chasiv Yar. And we haven't got many updates from the center because, understandably, most Ukrainian resistance is in this location. And it's just the most dense when it comes to structures and firepower. But over here in the northern district of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have been able to advance another 28 hectares, and they've almost reached the western edge of the city in this particular region, meaning that it's going to become more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to resupply what remains of the Chasiv Yar center. Because, yeah, you could see that there are roads over here, there are paved roads, but also ones that you can't see necessarily with Google Maps that are being used. But you could see out in between, it's pretty swampy. And some times of the year, there's a pond that's separating the rest of the Ukrainian rear from the center of Chasiv Yar. You also have these large forested regions where there's still a lot of foliage and trees, so it's hard to maneuver through those areas. And regardless, the corridor is pretty narrow at this point. It's like 1.2 kilometers. And so you can imagine getting fired on from both sides with a lot of Russian pressure being exerted on those flanks. It's going to be pretty difficult to continue resupplying such a important location in the long term that needs a lot of nourishment and needs a lot of supplies in order to sustain the level of defensive compactness that it currently has. And it's going to become worse and worse if the Russians actually are able to exploit the southern flank over here and continue taking control over regions in the northern flank of Chasiv Yar. Now, to move northwards, I do want to shift focus to the Terany region. The Russian forces over here have been able to take positions just north of Bilohorivka, which is a hamlet. It's located on the same road that connects to Ivanivka, which the Russians took earlier on in the month. So here the Russians were able to capture another 3 square kilometers of territory, meaning that now they have a pretty solid base west of the Zherbets River. It's going to be very hard for the Ukrainian garrison here to expel them. And the Ukrainian garrison more generally is a pretty substandard in this location. You could see that recently they received the 33rd Assault Regiment, which is a pretty good unit. It's recently been promoted from a battalion to a regiment, so that's 2 battalions, and it has a lot of Western equipment. Regardless, though, regiment's not going to be enough to change the course of the battles, but now it's been given a lot of the combat responsibilities of targeting the advancing Russian soldiers. Their goal, I believe, will be to, first of all, prevent the Russians from reaching Zarichny and then totally cutting off the eastern part of the Zherbets River. That's one thing, but also to prevent the Russians from exploiting their bridgehead that is currently formed, to prevent them from reaching the really zenith of the heights in this particular region, because you have this really high peak located essentially 7 kilometers northwest of where the Russians are currently at, and it overlooks the entire surrounding regions, even though a lot of them are still on the same ridge. This one point over here where you see the trenches are sort of protecting it, that's the highest elevated area in this region, and it overlooks the Zherbets River in its entirety. It's a great and very strategic location for the Ukrainians to hold on to, and projects power westwards into the various other villages that are connected by the few paved roads, because really you don't have a good road system in this location. You don't have enough roads that are well maintained that connect to all the various hamlets in these locations. A lot of it is just separated by forested regions and open hills. So the very few that are located in this region, they are in valleys, and they are completely exposed to any fire that would come from that higher zenith location. So that's something that the Russians will be looking at in the future. But to move further northwards, I want to see over here this geolocation, or not geolocation, but just Russian advance. It amounts to 8.4 square kilometers of territory just south of Andriivka and to the east of Stepney. The Russians have been able to close one of these very, very stubborn pockets of Ukrainian resistance. You could see that the Ukrainians, they maintain small groups north of this pond region in some of the forested regions, but there just was not a Russian impetus to close down the pocket up until now. And so the Russians have now clamped down on this region, and the Ukrainians have withdrawn southwards towards Nadia, which is another pretty small hamlet. So you could imagine that now with the continued Russian momentum, they could continue to chip away at territory over here and take it over along with Kopaniki. And then the line would be sort of stabilized, running along the road to Novosilka and to Nevohorivka a bit to the south. So those are upcoming possibilities. Then looking at the Varichino, this is interesting. The Russians over here have been able to exploit the lack of Ukrainian reinforcements, the lack of resources deployed to this area. There's not a lot of trenches either. It's just something that they did not expect, the Ukrainian side, and they've been able to take over 5 square kilometers over the past couple of days. This is really, really interesting. The Russians initially had a lot of speculative assaults that were repelled, but over time they were able to maintain control over larger and larger bridgeheads without being pushed back, and now they've been able to find a weak spot and completely exploit it. So the Ukrainians over here, they have elements of the 78th Hertz Regiment, an air assault unit that fought in the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, and since then has just been all over the place in Toretsk and Pokrovsk, etc. You also have the 40th Separate Rifle Battalion and 8th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. So it is a hodgepodge of smaller units, not a full brigade even. You're looking at like maximum 2,000 forces, probably even less, maybe like 1,500 that are defending over here. And I don't know the Russian size, but it's all coming in from the groupings that are also operating north of Kupiansk from the 25th Motor Rifle Brigade. So they've been able to exploit the weaknesses of the Ukrainian garrison over here and establish a constant supply feed. The next step is going to be to move armored vehicles across in order to exploit even deeper than Varichna, because Russian infantry has been sufficient to take over the entirety of the city. It's a pretty large settlement in relation to the nearby regions, but nonetheless, the Russians have been able to take it over in a relatively quick fashion. And now they've taken over several neighborhoods like Kirpichne and Sanuhivka and Debrivka over here. The only one that's fully left under Ukrainian control is Pidvarki. So that's something to really keep in mind, because the fall of the Varichna, it unlocks the road pushing northwestwards. And you could see how that one just runs along all the areas that the Russians lost during the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive, and also southwestwards, more importantly, to reach the road north of the western portion of Kupiansk. So again, it's something to keep in mind going into the future. And we'll have to see if the Russians double down on their force deployment in that region. But an area where the Russians are definitely doubling down is in the Kursk area. So first of all, and when in terms of like areas that have seen less heavy fighting but still see some sort of movement along the front line, it would be over here. So the Russians have been able to take at least part of Nikolaevo Darino. Some Russian sources claim that all of it has been captured by now, but at least based on geolocations, they've been able to take 2.12 square kilometers of territory. The 83rd VDV Brigade, they raised their flag in the southern portion of this village, and you can see the ruins in the video. The video itself, and you can see in the satellite imagery, the entire village just runs along one road. So the Russians being able to cross the Snhost River and establish a foothold, it does pretty much lend credence to the fact that they would be able to advance along the entirety of the road and take over whatever's left. And it would fall in line with the fact that now you have Darino and Nizhny Klin that are no longer under Ukrainian control, meaning the focus will shift towards areas like Sverdlikovo, because that's a really important conduit between Sumy and Suja and the rest of the Kursk region for the Ukrainians right now. The Russians also took territory that is pretty close to the border with Sumy previously, another 2 square kilometers. So they really are, putting some sort of emphasis on this location. And I think it's also a part of just getting control of positions that could be used to fire towards the supply lines that the Ukrainians are now desperately utilizing, really to increase the volume of reinforcements and movement back and forth into the Kursk region as the battles continue to intensify and reach a sort of climax in certain regions. And so now the Russians do have some of these like forward outposts, including in Nikolaev Vodorino, that could be used to fire towards the logistics routes, like this one over here that crosses near Gogolevka. But where we're actually seeing the fierce clashes include areas like Makhanovka, where the Ukrainians conducted a localized counterattack, took back 1.9 square kilometers of territory, were able to temporarily push the Russians out of the entirety of the village and thereby reduce pressure onto Sujo. I think we're going to see a lot of this whenever the Russians get a bit too close to the core of the Kursk region for the Ukrainians, that being Sujo. You're going to see a massive commitment in order to retain control over it. And this time it came from the 61st Mechanized Brigade. For the time being, it's been successful, and the Russian deployments over here have not been that serious. So I think that's also why the Russians were pretty easily pushed out of here in ways that they would not have been in other locations where they are more abundant in numbers. And one of those regions is over here to the north in the Malaya Luknaya region. This is an area where the Russian forces really are abundant when it comes to size, vehicle, equipment. They are really willing to risk large amounts of material damage if it's necessary to advance a couple of kilometers, because they really are the precipice of taking over the entirety of this northern corridor, this northern pocket, as you can refer to it. And we can see that based on recent geolocations starting on January 18th all the way up until the 20th of January. So I'll just read some of the Ukrainian claims that they made about Russian vehicular losses during the time period in this pretty narrow piece of territory. We're looking at like a maximum of 9 kilometers north or south where there's been these heavy fighting clashes. So on the 18th, the Ukrainians reported that 14 of the BMD-2s were damaged, or rather 4 of them were damaged, and they all belonged to the 234th Air Assault Regiment deployed in this region, also partially deployed in the Chasiv Yar area. On January 19th, 8 BMP-3s and 2 T-80s were destroyed, according to Ukrainian sources, all coming from the 155th Marine Brigade, which has been one of the main actors in this region. And then on January 20th, another 4 BMP-3s and 1 T-80 from, again, the 155th Marine Brigade, and 2 BMP-2s from the 22nd Motor Rifle Regiment, another one of these units deployed to the Pogrebki Malaya Luknaya line. And a lot of this is backed up by video footage. So, for instance, video footage geolocated on the 20th does show 8 BMP-3s getting destroyed, and also 2 armored fighting vehicles, in addition to the claims of the T-80s. So that's from the same assault that was mentioned by the Ukrainian sources. And this one was repelled by the 47th Mechanized Brigade, but there were others repelled by the air assault units like the 80th and 95th Brigades. During this particular assault, though, the Russian forces were able to expand control past Leonidovo, advance, 2.35 kilometers in an area that is pretty difficult to advance through. There's a lot of Ukrainian resistance in a very, very small chunk of territory. 2.3 kilometers or square kilometers is significant, and 3 kilometers eastwards, right within striking distance of Nikolsky, is also pretty important. You could also see that the Russians were able to reach the road that connects Viktorovka to Nikolaevka. And they advanced over here 1.45 square kilometers, and in total, maximum of 2 kilometers eastwards. They were able to reach the northern outskirts, but were repelled at that point by the Ukrainian forces deployed over here. So Ukrainian paratroopers destroyed 2 BMP-3s along this road, but it does play a role in putting in jeopardy the Ukrainian connectivity between an area like Pogrebki and Suja, because you can imagine how narrow the routes are becoming to supply back and forth. It's just becoming very, very difficult, and the Russian bombardment intensity is beginning to increase. But despite the fact that the road that really runs along Viktorovka has been cut off, you also have the one to the east of the rail line that is still acting as a backup line, and one that is slightly less, under intense bombardment. If we're looking at the corridor width, at a minimum, it's 3 kilometers. And so, in comparison to like Velyka Novosilka, it's not that dire, but still, you're looking at the Russians really knocking at the door, having a lot of villages used as organizing points, staging points for infantry and vehicle assaults that are so close to the areas where the Ukrainians are resisting. And then at the same time, you have to remember that the Ukrainians here, they have a massive logistical route to go through to even supply their forces here. You have to look at it like a trek of, what is this, like 20 kilometers to reach the Sumy border, and then even more to reach Suja. And at the same time, they are located on a really low-lying river valley overlooked by the areas the Russians are attacking through in these ridges to the west. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.